Have you ever stopped to think how a single decision can change the course of a life? Now imagine a story that involves power, betrayal, redemption, and a divine plan no one could have foreseen. This is the story of Bathsheba, a woman who was much more than David's wife and Solomon's mother. She was a central figure in one of the greatest scandals in the Bible, but also in one of the greatest demonstrations of grace and purpose. Why does this story still impact us so much today? Because it goes beyond sin and repentance. It shows us how God can take chaotic situations and turn them into something extraordinary. But here's the shocking secret. What you know about Bathsheba might just be the tip of the iceberg. What if I told you there's much more to this story than meets the eye? Get ready to dive into a narrative that will challenge your perspective on mistakes, forgiveness, and legacy. You'll discover how Bathsheba, a woman who started as a victim of adultery, became one of the most influential figures in biblical history. And most importantly, you'll learn how to apply these lessons to your own life. Are you ready to uncover the secrets behind Bathsheba? Then keep reading, because this story will change the way you see your own choices and the power of redemption. Bathsheba was a woman of rare beauty, and her story begins simply but soon takes a turn that would change not only her life, but also that of David, the king of Israel. Imagine this. You're at the height of your power, like David, and suddenly, something catches your attention in a way it shouldn't have. That's how it all began. David, from the balcony of his palace, saw Bathsheba bathing. And here we already have a lesson. Even the most powerful can fall into temptation if they don't guard their hearts. What David did next was a mistake that would echo for generations. Instead of looking away, he gave in to desire, and he didn't stop there. He sent for her, even though he knew she was a wife of Uriah, one of his most loyal soldiers. This shows us how sin, when not cut off at the root, can lead us to make increasingly worse decisions. David, the man after God's own heart, fell into one of the greatest scandals in the Bible. But why is this story so important? Because it reveals human fragility. David wasn't just any king. He was a man with a deep connection to God, yet he still failed. And this makes us reflect. If someone like David could fall, what about us? The lesson here is clear. We need to always be on guard because sin doesn't pick its victims. It just needs an opening. And what can we learn from Bathsheba in this moment? She didn't have much of a choice. In those times, women didn't have a voice, especially not before a king. But her story reminds us that even in situations where it seems we have no control, God is still in charge. Bathsheba wasn't just a victim. She would become part of a greater plan, but that's a topic for later. Finally, this story challenges us to look at our own lives. How often do we let ourselves be carried away by momentary desires without thinking about the consequences? David never imagined that one simple glance would bring so much pain and regret. And you? Have you ever stopped to think how small choices can change everything? Something to reflect on. When Bathsheba discovered she was pregnant, she sent a message to David, "I am pregnant." Those two words were enough to trigger a series of events that show just how far sin can take us. Instead of taking responsibility, David decided to devise a plan to cover up his mistake. He called Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, back from the battlefield, hoping he would go home and sleep with his wife, so the pregnancy would be attributed to him. But Uriah was a man of principle. He refused to go home while his comrades were on the battlefield. Imagine the scene. David, the king, tried to manipulate the situation, and Uriah, a simple soldier, showing more integrity than the monarch himself. This teaches us that honesty and loyalty are virtues that cannot be bought or manipulated. David then tried another strategy. He got Uriah drunk, hoping that under the influence of alcohol, he would give in and go home. But even then, Uriah held his ground. How often, in our own lives, do we try to manipulate situations for our benefit, only to discover that the truth always comes to light? David was about to learn this lesson the hard way. Frustrated, David took the darkest step. He ordered Uriah to be placed on the front lines of battle, where death was almost certain. And so it happened. Uriah died, and David thought he had solved his problem. But what he didn't realize is that you can deceive people, but you can never deceive God. David's sin wouldn't stay hidden for long. This part of the story makes us reflect on the consequences of our actions. How often do we try to fix our mistakes with more mistakes, only to make things worse? David thought he was in control, but the truth is that every step he took him further from God. And you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you try to fix something only to watch it all fall apart? With Uriah's death, David thought he had finally solved his problem. He brought Bathsheba to the palace and married her, perhaps hoping that everything would be forgotten. But as the saying goes, sin will always find out the sinner. David may have thought he was in control, but the truth is that he was only digging himself into a deeper hole. Bathsheba, now a widow, became David's wife. But what seemed like a quick fix ended up becoming a source of pain and regret. Imagine Bathsheba's position. She lost her husband, was taken to the palace, and now carried away with a secret that could destroy everyone. Her life, which was once simple, was now at the center of one of the greatest scandals in the Bible. And here's an important lesson. Our actions have consequences that go beyond ourselves. David didn't think about the impact his choices would have on Bathsheba, Uriah, or even the people of Israel. He was so focused on covering up his sin that he didn't consider the emotional and spiritual cost it would bring. But even in the midst of this mess, there's a thread of hope. Bathsheba, despite everything, will become a key figure in God's plan. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of a bigger story that was still unfolding. This reminds us that even in our worst failures, God can bring something good. And you? Have you ever stopped to think about how your choices affect the people around you? David learned the hard way that sin never affects just one person. It has a domino effect, impacting everyone around us. But as we'll see in the next topic, even in the midst of chaos, there's room for redemption. While David tried to move on with his life, thinking he had escaped the consequences of his actions, God sent the prophet Nathan to confront him. And here's something fascinating. God didn't send an army or a plague. He sent a man with a story. Nathan told David a parable about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb. David, outraged, said the rich man deserved to die. It was then that Nathan revealed, "You are that man." Imagine the scene. David the king being confronted so directly and powerfully. He could no longer hide behind excuses or justifications. David's sin was exposed, not through direct accusations, but through a story that touched his heart. This shows us that sometimes the truth needs to be told in a way that makes us see beyond our own justifications. David's reaction was immediate. He acknowledged his sin and repented. He didn't try to defend himself or blame Bathsheba. He took responsibility for his actions. And here's a powerful lesson. True repentance begins when we stop blaming others and recognize our own failure. David, despite his flaws, showed that he was still a man after God's own heart. But repentance doesn't erase the consequences. Nathan told David that although his sin was forgiven, the consequences would be severe. The sword would never depart from David's house, and the child Bathsheba was expecting would die. This reminds us that while God forgives, the choices we make still come with a price. And you? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to face the consequences of your actions? David teaches us that no matter how painful it may be, repentance is the first step toward restoration. But the story doesn't end here. The death of David and Bathsheba's child will be just the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. When the son of David and Bathsheba became ill, David was overcome with despair. He fasted, prayed, and prostrated himself before God, pleading for the child's life. For 7 days, he refused to eat or rise from the ground. His servants tried to convince him to eat, but he refused. David was willing to do anything to save his son. But despite his fervent prayers, the child died. When David learned the news, he got up, washed himself, dressed, and went to worship God. His servants were confused. How could he act this way after the death of his son? David explained, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept For I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. David's reaction teaches us something profound about acceptance and faith. He understood that even though God did not grant his request, he was still worthy of worship. David showed that true faith doesn't depend on God doing what we want, but on trusting him even when things don't go as we hope. And here's a practical lesson. How do we handle loss in our lives? David teaches us that even in the midst of pain, we can find peace by submitting to God's will. He didn't remain stuck in grief. He got up and moved forward. This doesn't mean the pain disappeared, but that he chose to trust God despite it. But the story of David and Bathsheba doesn't end here. The death of their son was a turning point, but it was also a prelude to what was to come. Bathsheba would still play a crucial role in David's reign and the future of Israel. And you? Have you ever experienced a loss that seemed like the end but turned out to be the beginning of something new? After the death of their first son, Bathsheba gave birth to another child, Solomon. This boy wasn't just another heir. He was God's answer to David's repentance and Bathsheba's faith. Solomon, whose name means peace, would be God's instrument to bring stability and wisdom to the kingdom of Israel. And here's something amazing. God transformed the story of sin and pain into a legacy of redemption and purpose. Bathsheba, now the mother of Solomon, took on a role of influence in the palace. She was no longer just a woman caught up in a scandal. She was a mother of the future king. And this shows us that God can take our greatest failures and use them for something greater. Bathsheba, who was once seen as a victim, became a central figure in God's plan for Israel. David, now old, promised Bathsheba that Solomon would be a successor. This promise wasn't just an act of love. It was a recognition of the role Bathsheba and Solomon would play in Israel's future. And here's a powerful lesson. Our lives aren't defined by our mistakes, but by how we respond to God's forgiveness and grace. Solomon grew up to become one of Israel's greatest kings, known for his wisdom and wealth. But behind his success was the influence of his mother, Bathsheba. She didn't just raise him, she prepared him to lead a kingdom. This makes us think, what legacy are we leaving for the next generation? Bathsheba teaches us that even in the midst of adversity, we can influence the future in a positive way. And you? Have you ever stopped to think how your actions today can impact tomorrow? Bathsheba's story reminds us that even when everything seems lost, God can transform our lives into something extraordinary. But this isn't just a story from the past. It's an invitation to reflect on our own legacy. So, what did you think of this journey through Bathsheba's life? It wasn't just a story full of twists and turns, but also a practical lesson on how our choices can have profound consequences, and yet how God's grace can transform even the biggest mistakes into something great. Think about it. How many times have you found yourself in situations where it feels like there's no way out? Bathsheba's story shows us that even in the darkest moments, there is hope. And more than that, it challenges us to reflect on our own legacy. What kind of influence are you leaving on the people around you? What marks do you want your story to leave on the world? Now it's your turn to act. How about starting today to make choices that honor not only yourself, but also those who depend on you? And if you want to keep diving into stories like this, full of wisdom and practical lessons, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss any content that could transform your life. So, are you ready to write the next page of your story? The choice is yours.